Athena and the Weaver of Destiny. The first light of dawn touched the city of Athens like a painter's brush on a blank canvas. Streaks of soft pink and gentle gold swept across the marble stones of the Acropolis, bathing it in a glow so tender it seemed as though the world itself was being born anew. The grand Parthenon, standing tall at the heart of the sacred hill, shimmered like a polished pearl. Its towering white columns cast long, sharp shadows across the ground as the sun slowly climbed higher. Below, the city stirred. The air hummed with the sounds of life beginning. The distant caw of roosters calling from rooftops, the soft thud of market stalls being set up, and the rhythmic clatter of clay pots being stacked by merchants preparing for the day's trade. The faint smell of fresh bread, warm honey, and sunlit olives drifted through the narrow streets. Children chased each other through alleyways, their laughter light as sparrows darting through the air. But high above it all, seated upon the edge of the Parthenon's roof, was a figure watching it all in still silence. Athena. Her presence was as steady as stone, her gaze sharp as a falcon's. Her eyes, storm gray and unblinking, followed the life below with quiet precision. No detail escaped her. The sway of a merchant's hand, the child who stumbled and was caught by her mother, the olive tree whose leaves quivered from the soft morning breeze. She saw it all, her mind weaving it into meaning as if it were a tapestry being spun before her. Her armor, silver-plated and smooth as calm waters, caught the soft glow of the sun's first light. Her bronze shield leaned against her side, resting on the edge of the marble like a lion in repose. A spear, long and straight as a cedar tree, lay beside her, its tip pointed at the sky. But it was not these tools of war that defined her in that moment. It was the quiet owl perched on her shoulder. Glaucopus, her sacred owl, blinked slowly, its large golden eyes as round and watchful as the full moon. It ruffled its feathers once, tilting its head, sensing something unseen. Athena's hand rose to stroke the back of its head with a soft, deliberate touch. The owl hooted quietly in response, the sound barely louder than the rustle of a falling leaf. Athena tilted her head slightly, her gaze distant now. Her sharp eyes lifted from the mortal streets below and turned to the open sky, her expression soft but thoughtful. For a moment, all was still. But then, the breeze changed. A soft wind, light as a breath, swept across her face. It was not the wind of the morning. It came from another place, unseen and distant, carrying something with it. A sound, not a word, but a whisper. Her eyes narrowed, her gaze sharpened. A name drifted through the air like a loose thread pulled from a seam. It wove itself into her ear, clear as a bell, yet faint as an echo. Arachne. Athena's fingers stopped stroking the owl. Her gaze remained fixed on the sky, her eyes like gray steel freshly sharpened. She knew the name of a mortal girl, a weaver. Not just any weaver, but one whose skill had begun to reach far beyond her small village. It was said her hands moved faster than the wings of a hummingbird, that her threads never tangled, and that her tapestries captured life so vividly that one could hear the sea crashing in the waves she wove into her cloth. Her lips pressed into a thin line. The owl tilted its head, sensing the shift in her mood. Another breeze came, stronger this time, and it brought with it more than a name. Words. They were not spoken to Athena directly, but they reached her all the same. The words drifted on the wind like gossip through a crowded market. They were words spoken from village to village, carried on the tongues of fishermen, farmers, and wandering merchants alike. She claims her weaving surpasses even the gods, the wind whispered. She says her hands are swifter than Athena's, that no loom, mortal or divine, could match her threads. Athena's eyes darkened. Her fingers curled slightly, her nails pressing softly against her armored knees. Even the goddess of wisdom could not weave a finer tapestry than me. The words hung in the air, longer than the breeze itself. Her jaw tightened, her gaze unblinking, as she stared into the open sky. The stillness that surrounded her shifted. The air grew heavier, though not by sight or sound. It was a stillness of weight, like the pause before thunder breaks. Her owl blinked twice. "Pride," she murmured, her voice quiet as the roll of distant thunder. Her eyes lowered, sharp and steady. It always begins with pride. Her gaze lingered on the distant horizon. She could already see it in her mind. The quiet village where Arachne worked her loom, her fingers weaving bold colors into sharp, vivid scenes. Her hands moving so quickly, so surely, that she believed herself untouchable. Mortals often believed such things. Mortals believed in many illusions, but pride was the strongest of them all. Athena rose slowly, her spear in hand, her cloak of deep gray shifting like waves of smoke. Her armor did not clatter as she moved. Her gaze remained fixed on the distant point of the world where the name Arachne had come from. "You claim mastery over the loom," she said quietly, her voice as calm as a mother speaking to a child. Her eyes narrowed. "Let us see if your threads can hold against the weight of the sky." The owl spread its wings, taking flight with a quiet rush of air. It circled once around her, then flew ahead, its wings cutting through the wind. Athena lifted her spear, tapping it lightly against the marble beneath her feet. The sharp clang echoed like a bell ringing in the heavens. Her body shimmered faintly. Her armor did not clatter as she moved. Her gaze remained fixed on the distant point of the world where the name Arachne had come from. "You claim mastery over the loom," she said quietly, her voice as calm as a mother speaking to a child. Her eyes narrowed. "Let us see if your threads can hold against the weight of the sky." The owl spread its wings, taking flight with a quiet rush of air. It circled once around her, then flew ahead, its wings cutting through the wind. Athena lifted her spear, tapping it lightly against the marble beneath her feet. The sharp clang echoed like a bell ringing in the heavens. Her body shimmered faintly. Its people, unaware of what was to come, gathered in the town square to watch something marvelous. A woman was weaving. Her loom stood at the center of the square, framed by the wide circle of gathered villagers. Her fingers moved like birds darting between branches. The threads shimmered as they passed through her hands. Blue, red, gold, and green. The colors wove together so perfectly that the cloth itself seemed to breathe. The villagers watched in quiet awe, their eyes wide, as if gazing at the work of a goddess herself. The woman smiled as she worked, her eyes sharp, her face lit with quiet pride. Each thread she passed through her loom told a story. Scenes of men and gods, of the sea, of great cities, of fire, of triumph, and of tragedy. Every figure on the tapestry was alive with motion, and at the center of it all, she wove the image of a goddess. Her arms raised high, her spear in hand, her face calm but stern. It was Athena herself, her eyes cold and distant as stone. The villagers whispered, awestruck but uneasy. "She's weaving the gods," one man muttered, his voice low with concern. "She's weaving the gods as if they were mortals." Another woman, clutching her child's hand, glanced around nervously. "Does she not fear they will see it?" "If they see it," Arachne called out, her fingers still weaving, her eyes never turning from her loom. "Then let them see the truth. No god is beyond it." Her fingers moved faster, bolder. Her eyes glowed with the fire of certainty. But on the far edge of the crowd, a new figure appeared. She was old, wrapped in a simple cloak, her face hidden beneath a hood. No one paid her any mind. No one noticed her eyes, storm gray, sharp as ever. Athena had arrived. The village of Colophon lay bathed in golden noon light. Its cobblestone streets were warm beneath bare feet, and the air buzzed with the sound of bees darting between wildflowers that grew along the edges of homes. Villagers gathered in the town square, drawn like moths to a single dazzling flame. At the center of the square stood a large wooden loom, its frame smooth from use. Colorful spools of thread, scarlet red, deep blue, and rich gold, hung from the sides, ready to be drawn into the tapestry. And there, seated before it, was Arachne. Her fingers darted between the threads, swift and sure, weaving them together with perfect precision. Each strand passed through her hands like silk through water, each movement as fluid as the flicker of a flame. Her eyes, sharp and full of purpose, remained locked on her work. Her brow was furrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line of quiet concentration. Her hands moved faster than thought. The crowd around her watched in stunned silence. Their gazes flicked between her and the tapestry that grew steadily beneath her touch. It was no mere cloth of patterns or flowers. No, Arachne's work was something far more daring. Upon the growing fabric, she wove gods. The villagers murmured among themselves. Some glanced toward the sky, whispering soft prayers under their breath. Others dared not look away, transfixed by what was unfolding before them. On the tapestry, Zeus was depicted not as a noble king, but as a man disguised in mortal form. His eyes narrowed with mischief as he approached a mortal woman. Poseidon, the god of the sea, was shown wielding his trident, but not as a protector. No, he was locked in a quarrel with another god, his face twisted with pride and anger. Even Athena was woven into the cloth, her face stern, her brow furrowed in frustration as she gazed down upon mortals. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "She's showing the gods," he whispered. "But they look angry, quiet," his mother hushed, pulling him close. Her eyes darted toward the clouds above, watching for signs of storm clouds. "Do you see how she shows Zeus?" whispered an older man, his voice tight with unease. "That's no king of kings. That's a deceiver." "Her hands move like lightning," muttered another, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. Too fast, too bold. But Arachne heard them. Her lips curled into a small smile as she wove another thread of gold into the form of Demeter. But instead of the goddess of the harvest depicted as kind and nurturing, she wove her eyes hollow with grief, her hands gripping the ground as if searching for something lost. The villagers gasped. "Too bold," someone muttered again. "Too true," Arachne replied, not looking up from her loom. Her fingers pulled the red thread tight, weaving it through with swift precision. If the gods are offended by truth, then perhaps it is not truth that is the problem. The villagers glanced at each other, uneasy now. The old man shuffled a step back, his eyes darting toward the altar at the edge of the square. "She speaks too freely," he muttered. "The gods hear everything." And the gods had heard. On the edge of the crowd, unnoticed by most, stood an old woman wrapped in a tattered gray cloak. She leaned on a walking staff made of olive wood, her head bowed low as though her neck could no longer bear its weight. Her hands, weathered and lined with age, gripped the staff firmly, but her eyes, sharp and clear as a fresh blade, peered from beneath her hood. No one saw her enter. No one asked her name. She had simply appeared, as silent as mist rolling in at dawn. Her eyes did not flicker. They stayed locked on Arachne. Her gaze was steady, watching each flick of her fingers, each choice of thread, and each shift of color. Her breath was slow and measured, but her eyes missed nothing. At last, she spoke. Her voice was soft, but carried an edge, like a reed flute played on the edge of a cliff. "Child," she called, her voice cutting through the low hum of murmurs. "Do you not fear that the gods will hear your words?" Arachne's fingers hesitated for half a breath, just half a breath, before continuing. She did not turn her head, her eyes fixed on her loom. "If they hear me, then let them see my work," Arachne replied, her voice smooth as silk. Her fingers darted faster, weaving another thread of blue into the figure of Hades. His face was shadowed, his eyes like hollow sockets of darkness. She glanced at the old woman, her smile sharp and bold. "Let Athena see it herself, if she dares." The villagers gasped. Several took quick steps back, eyes darting toward the gray sky above. Ormenos, the old man who had spoken before, took off his hat and clutched it to his chest, muttering a prayer beneath his breath. The old woman leaned forward slowly, her gray eyes like storm clouds on the edge of breaking, her lips pressed into a thin, quiet smile. "Be careful, child," she said softly. "You may call for gods without knowing which one will answer." A chill passed through the crowd. No one spoke. Then, the old woman stepped forward. Her movements were slow, but certain. Her grip on the olive wood staff tightened, and she leaned forward, eyes fixed on Arachne. "Look at me," the old woman said quietly, her voice no longer soft, but firm as a command. Arachne's fingers stilled. Her hands hovered over the loom as if frozen in midair. Her eyes, so sharp and filled with fire, turned slowly toward the old woman. For the first time, doubt flickered in her gaze. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Her eyes moved over the old woman's face, the deep wrinkles of age, the thin gray strands of hair, and those eyes that were not old at all. Arachne blinked. Her gaze shifted downward, then back up. Her heart tightened in her chest. No mortal eyes are that sharp. The old woman's smile vanished. Her hands released the staff. And in that instant, everything changed. The air around the old woman shimmered like heat rising from stone. Her gray cloak fell away like a veil of mist, and the soft folds of wool became shining silver armor. Her staff twisted, its wood hardening, straightening, transforming into a spear. Her hands, once weathered with age, grew strong and smooth. Her gray eyes brightened, no longer the eyes of an old woman, but the sharp, unyielding gaze of a goddess. Gasps echoed through the square. The villagers fell to their knees, eyes wide with fear. A child clutched his mother's skirt, hiding his face. Arachne sat frozen before her loom, her eyes locked on the figure now standing before her. Silver armor gleamed in the golden sunlight. The air hummed with quiet, unseen power. Her shield rested at her side, and the owl, Glaucopus, flew down to land on her shoulder with a soft flutter of wings. "Athena," Ormenos whispered, his eyes filled with terror. "Goddess of wisdom and war." Athena's eyes fixed on Arachne, not with rage, not with fury, but with something far heavier: disappointment. "You called for me, child," Athena said, her voice quiet but full of weight. "Here I am." Arachne's heart thundered in her chest. Her fingers tightened on the loom, but her eyes stayed on Athena. For all the fear she felt, she did not lower her gaze. She swallowed hard, and for the first time, her pride faltered, but it did not break. "If you have come to prove me wrong," Arachne said softly, her voice steadier than it should have been, "then weave." The villagers gasped. Athena tilted her head, her eyes narrowed. She stepped forward slowly, her armored boots pressing into the ground with soft, deliberate thuds. Her gray eyes met Arachne's without blinking. "You have called the storm, mortal," Athena said, her voice low, steady, and sharp as the edge of a blade. Her spear tapped the ground once, sending a soft clang into the air. "Then let us weave it together." The sky above the village of Colophon had shifted. The gentle glow of the noon sun had dimmed, and a thin veil of gray clouds drifted slowly across the heavens. It was not a storm, but the kind of still, overcast sky that comes before the world holds its breath. At the center of the village square, two looms stood side by side. One was old, its frame made of rough oak, worn smooth by years of use. The other had not been there moments before. It had appeared, as if summoned by unseen hands. Its wood was pale and flawless, polished to a shine that caught the faintest light. Each corner of its frame was adorned with small carvings of olive leaves, and its threads shimmered like strands of starlight. On one side of the looms stood Arachne. Her fingers were already moving, sharp and swift as a sparrow's wings. The crowd had shifted to give her space, but their eyes never left her. Her jaw was tight, her face calm, but her eyes burned with unspoken fire. Her hands darted across the loom as though she had been weaving since the moment she was born. On the other side stood Athena. Her silver armor caught the pale light of the sky, but she had set her shield and spear aside. Her fingers moved with slow, deliberate precision. Unlike Arachne's, her movements were not fast, but steady. Every thread pulled with purpose, every weave calculated with the patience of one who has seen the rise and fall of empires. Her gaze was calm, her face smooth as stone. She did not need to look at the villagers, for she had seen them watch her many times before. She did not need to prove herself. She simply wove. The villagers stood in complete silence, too afraid to speak, too awestruck to turn away. Even the birds that usually darted through the air had fallen still, perching quietly on rooftops, watching as if they too were drawn by the gravity of this moment. 2 women, 2 looms, 1 contest. The work begins. Arachne's hands moved faster than mortal eyes could follow. Each thread she pulled was bold, each weave sharp. Her tapestry bloomed with vibrant color: crimson red, deep blue, and bright gold, all shining with the fire of living stories. Her scenes did not speak of gentle beauty or divine splendor. No, her hands told the truth. The first scene she wove was of Zeus, not as a king upon his throne, but as a man walking among mortals in disguise, his eyes sly, his hands reaching toward a mortal woman who stepped back, wary but helpless. Her face was woven with such pain that one of the villagers gasped aloud. "She shows him as a trickster," someone whispered. "Does she not fear his wrath?" But Arachne's hands did not falter. Next, she wove Poseidon, the god of the sea, not in his chariot of glory, but locked in a quarrel with Athena herself. Their faces twisted with rage, their hands gripping tridents and spears, their eyes fierce with stubborn pride. The sea beneath them churned in jagged, sharp waves, and mortals on the shore clutched one another as they watched the gods rage. Her threads flickered with motion so real that the villagers could almost hear the roar of the sea. Arachne's eyes narrowed with concentration. Her breathing was steady, her fingers moving faster now, drawing thread after thread into her design. Her gaze shifted to Athena's loom, and for a heartbeat, her lips curled into a small smile. But Athena did not look at her. She did not glance at Arachne or the villagers. Her eyes remained on her loom. Her fingers moved with the grace of a weaver who had woven since the birth of the world. Slowly, steadily, her tapestry took form. Her first scene was one of grandeur. She wove Zeus, but not as a trickster. No, she wove him as a king, his throne vast as the sky, his robes lined with gold and white clouds. Lightning arced from his hand, his eyes fierce but just. The villagers' eyes widened as they gazed at him, a vision of pure power and authority. Her next scene was of Poseidon, his chariot pulled by seahorses, his trident raised high as he calmed the waves. His face was calm, his eyes proud, his presence commanding. Mortals watched him from the shores, their faces filled with gratitude, their arms raised in thanks. The sea she wove was not wild but serene, its waves soft as rippling cloth. Every line of Athena's tapestry was precise, every color perfect. Her threads did not rush, her story did not seek to provoke, but to inspire. She wove not the truth, but the ideal. Her tapestry was not of the world as it was. It was the world as it should be. The dual in full bloom. The villagers whispered as they watched the 2 works grow. Their eyes darted between Arachne's fierce, raw depictions of flawed gods and Athena's noble, radiant depictions of divine perfection. Some were drawn to the boldness of Arachne's vision. Others, however, felt the pull of Athena's calm, idealized beauty. "Her colors are too wild," one man muttered, his eyes on Arachne's tapestry. "She mocks them, but it's the truth," a woman replied softly, her gaze locked on the figure of Zeus in disguise. "Look at him. Look at his face. You can see it." "Look at Athena's," another voice said. "That's the face of a king." The villagers watched, their hearts pulled in two directions. The final threads. Arachne moved faster now. Her fingers darted between threads like lightning, her breathing sharper, faster. Her jaw was set, her gaze fixed on the loom, her brow furrowed with intensity. She knew Athena's work was beautiful. But beauty did not frighten her. Truth was stronger than beauty. Honesty was sharper than perfection. The final image she wove was of Athena herself, her arms raised in command, her face stern, her eyes sharp as knives. But her gaze, in Arachne's tapestry, was not one of wisdom. It was one of pride. Her brows were tight, her mouth pressed into a hard, narrow line. It was the face of a goddess unyielding, unwavering, and unwilling to see her own flaws. The villagers fell silent. No one dared to speak. No one dared to look at Athena. Athena's fingers did not falter. Her gaze remained calm, her movements slow and deliberate. Her final scene was one of unity. She wove a great olive tree, its roots stretching deep into the soil, its branches reaching toward the sky. Under its shade, mortals and gods sat together in peace. Farmers brought forth grain, fishermen raised nets of silverfish, and children sat at the feet of Demeter, listening as she wove stories of the harvest. Her thread of gold shimmered with warmth as the scene came together, every figure woven with care. The two women wove the final threads of their work. With a soft exhale, Arachne tied the last knot. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the cloth for just a moment. Her eyes darted toward Athena. Her lips curled into a quiet, triumphant smile. Athena's hands moved one last time. She pulled the thread tight. Her eyes were steady, her expression calm. She breathed out slowly, like a soldier placing down his shield after battle. The tapestries were complete. The villagers stepped forward slowly, as if afraid to disturb the air. Their gazes moved from Arachne's work to Athena's, their faces tense with quiet wonder. No one spoke. No one knew which one was greater. Arachne's tapestry hummed with truth, raw, honest, undeniable. It made the gods look small, their flaws bare for all to see. Athena's tapestry shimmered with grandeur, perfect, noble, divine. It inspired awe, not fear. It reminded mortals of something to aspire to, not something to despise. Athena stepped forward, her eyes falling on Arachne's work. She stood still for a moment, gazing at her own reflection on the cloth. Her face, woven with pride. Her eyes, woven with judgment. Her fingers brushed the edge of the tapestry. Her eyes flicked to Arachne. Her gaze was calm, but colder than before. "You have woven well," Athena said softly. "So well, in fact, that you have revealed the one thread you never should have touched." Arachne's breath caught in her throat. "You have woven the pride of the gods," Athena said, her eyes sharp as a blade. "And now, child, you will wear it." The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the square. The clouds overhead remained thin and gray, soft as a veil, dimming the light just enough to turn the world a shade colder. The air was thick with the quiet weight of anticipation, the kind that comes before an inevitable verdict. Two tapestries hung side by side. On the left, Arachne's tapestry blazed with raw, unflinching honesty. Its figures were bold, lifelike, and unafraid. Zeus stood disguised as a mortal, his eyes sly with cunning. Poseidon clashed with Athena, their faces twisted in fury, their pride sharp as spears. And there, at the center of it all, was Athena herself. Her face, woven with breathtaking detail, bore the look of quiet frustration, a goddess not of grace, but of stubborn pride. The villagers could not look at it without their chests tightening with unease. On the right, Athena's tapestry shimmered like the first light of dawn. Her work was radiant and divine, every thread a beam of light pulled from the sun. Her Zeus sat as a king on a throne of clouds, his face calm, his eyes steady. Poseidon commanded the sea, not in fury, but in control, his chariot riding the waves like a song in motion. Her final scene, the olive tree of peace, shone brightest of all. Mortals sat beneath its shade, gazing up at the gods with trust and hope, not fear. It was a vision of the world as it could be. The villagers stood in a wide, silent circle. No one dared to speak. No one dared to choose. Their eyes flicked between the two works, their faces filled with quiet awe. "It's like looking at two truths," whispered Ormenos, his old eyes darting between them. "One is the world as it is, and the other is the world as it should be." No one replied, but all of them felt it. Athena stepped forward, her silver-plated armor catching the dimming sunlight. Her movements were slow, steady, and deliberate. The villagers shifted back as she approached, their gazes fixed on her every step. She stood between the two tapestries, her eyes moving from one to the other. Her gaze lingered on Arachne's work. Her fingers reached out, brushing the edge of the cloth. Her fingertips slid softly along the woven fabric, feeling the smooth lines of thread. Her face remained still. Her eyes were sharp, cold as frost. There was something more. Recognition. Her gaze traced the image of herself, her face woven with that stern, unyielding expression. Her lips pressed into a tight line. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. Pride, perhaps, or something far heavier. For a moment, it seemed as though she might smile, but she didn't. Her eyes grew hard. She stepped back. She turned to face Arachne. The mortal girl stood still before her loom, her head high, her fingers clasped together. She had not lowered her eyes. Her breathing was steady, her face calm. Her gaze did not flicker with doubt. Not even now. Athena's eyes narrowed. "Your skill is undeniable," she said, her voice cool but sharp, like a spear's edge. "No mortal I have ever seen could weave as you have woven today." A murmur spread through the crowd. Arachne's eyes widened just slightly, but she did not bow. She did not kneel. She only nodded once, as if the goddess had merely confirmed something she already knew. "But," Athena continued, her voice growing firmer, "there is a thread in your work that should never have been pulled." She glanced once more at the image of herself, woven with all her flaws laid bare. Her eyes lingered on her own face for a moment longer than necessary. Then slowly, her gaze returned to Arachne. "You have shown me as I am," Athena said quietly, her words slow and deliberate. Her eyes met Arachne's with the weight of a storm pressing down on the sea. "But do you think that truth gives you the right to mock the divine?" Arachne's lips parted. Her breath caught, but her eyes stayed steady. She tilted her head ever so slightly, like a hawk watching the shifting winds. "It is not mockery," Arachne replied, her voice firm but quiet. "It is truth." Her hands moved slowly, brushing the edge of her tapestry. Her gaze did not leave Athena's. I wove the world as it is. Her eyes flicked toward Athena's tapestry, then back to her. You wove it as you wish it to be. Gasps echoed from the crowd. Ormanos' hand shot to his mouth. By the gods, she will be struck down, he whispered. His voice trembled with the certainty of an old man who had seen what happens to those who speak too boldly. Mothers pulled their children close. Men stepped away, eyes darting toward the sky, expecting thunder at any moment. But no thunder came. Athena's eyes remained fixed on Arachne. Her gaze was as still as the surface of a deep lake. Her breathing was slow, steady, controlled. But something was building beneath it, something silent and cold. You are bold, mortal, Athena said softly, her voice low and clear. Her eyes did not blink. Too bold. Arachne opened her mouth to speak, but she stopped. Her eyes shifted. Her hands twitched. The air had changed. It was subtle at first. A pressure. A weight. The villagers felt it too, their eyes darting to the sky. The gray clouds above shifted, growing denser. The light dimmed further. The air grew cool, cold enough that a few villagers rubbed their arms as goosebumps crept up their skin. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't thunder. It was heavier. Arachne's eyes darted toward Athena. She stepped back, her feet shuffling against the ground. You asked for the truth, she said, her voice sharper now, filled with the first signs of uncertainty. Her eyes flickered, glancing around as if searching for a way out. I only wove what I see. I only wove what is real. Athena stepped forward, slowly, calmly. The space between them shrank with every step, like a hunter closing in on a cornered animal. Her eyes stayed on Arachne, unblinking, unwavering. Her fingers brushed the edge of her spear, but she did not lift it. She didn't have to. You have shown the flaws of the gods, Athena said softly, her voice no longer cold but certain. And for that, I grant you a gift. Her hand rose slowly, her fingers poised like the hand of a weaver about to thread a needle. Arachne's eyes went wide. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Athena's eyes locked onto hers, and in that gaze, there was no hatred, no anger, only decision. You will weave forever, Athena said, her voice soft as a mother's lullaby. Her fingers flicked once, as if tying a final knot. But no loom will ever hold your thread. The weight in the air fell. The villagers gasped. Ormanos staggered back, eyes wide with horror. Mothers turned away, shielding their children's faces from what was about to happen. Arachne tried to move. Her legs buckled. Her arms twisted in a way that arms should not twist. Her breath hitched, and her hands clutched her stomach as her fingers curled inward. Her skin shifted. Her fingers, once so nimble, grew long and thin. Her back arched. Her legs shrank. Her body grew smaller and smaller, her eyes wide with panic, her voice rising in a high, sharp cry. The villagers watched in horror as her limbs shriveled and twisted into long, spindly legs. Her fingers became thin, sharp points. Her face shrank, her mouth disappearing, her eyes growing round and black. Her cry of terror was cut off as her voice vanished. All that remained was a small, dark shape that skittered to the ground. The villagers did not move. They watched in stunned silence as the spider crawled up the leg of the loom, its tiny legs clicking softly. It reached the top And there, in the corner of the loom's frame, it began to spin. Threads of silver silk flowed from its body, weaving a perfect, intricate web. No one spoke. Athena gazed at the web, her gray eyes thoughtful, her lips pressed into a thin, quiet line. Her skill remains, she thought, but her pride has been unwoven. She stepped back, gazing at the small, fragile creature spinning its web. "Let this be your loom," Athena said softly. "Forever." The villagers stood in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the delicate threads glistening in the soft light of dusk. High on the edge of the wooden loom, the small spider moved with careful precision. Its thin, spindly legs darted back and forth, pulling fine silver threads into a spiral of perfect geometry. Each line shimmered faintly, with dew-like droplets, catching the last glow of daylight. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the softest breath seemed too loud. Ormenos, his old eyes wide with wonder and fear, slowly sank to one knee. His gaze flickered between Athena and the spider that had once been Arachne. "She still weaves," he muttered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Even now, she still weaves." The villagers watched the spider in silent awe. Its small body swayed as it worked, moving from one strand to the next, its legs moving with the grace of an artisan who had spent a lifetime mastering their craft. The web was not a simple trap of tangled silk. It was a masterpiece. The threads shone like silver wire, each line perfectly spaced, each crossing point as delicate and sharp as a cut gem. A young girl stepped forward, her eyes wide with innocent wonder. She pulled free from her mother's hand and gazed up at the web with an open mouth. "It's so pretty," she whispered, reaching toward it with her small fingers. "Don't touch it," her mother said sharply, pulling her back. The girl blinked in confusion, looking from the spider to her mother, not understanding the weight of what had happened. Athena watched them quietly. Her eyes lingered on the child for a moment longer than the rest. Her gaze shifted to the spider. It moved with a patience it had not known before. No rush, no haste. Just the steady, quiet work of weaving one line after another. Slowly, carefully. No need for pride, no need for boasting. The villagers began to whisper again, their voices low and uneasy. "Was it mercy?" a woman asked, her eyes locked on the spider. "Mercy?" muttered another man, shaking his head. "No, it was punishment. Punishment. Or fate," said Ormenos softly, his eyes narrowed with quiet thought. He glanced toward Athena, but quickly lowered his gaze, as though afraid to meet her eyes for too long. "There is no mercy without lesson. The gods do not give without taking." Athena's eyes shifted toward him, but she said nothing. Her gaze moved slowly to the spider. She watched it in silence. Her face was calm, still as a mask of marble, but her eyes flickered with something unseen. Her fingers curled slightly, then relaxed. She stood there for a long moment, watching the small creature spin its web, her silver-plated armor faintly glowing in the fading light. The villagers remained still, watching her, waiting for her to speak. She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of mortals waiting for their goddess to offer wisdom. But she did not speak right away. Finally, she took a slow step forward. Her gaze remained on the spider as she approached the loom. Her fingers, calloused from war but steady from craftsmanship, brushed the frame of the loom lightly, feeling its worn edges beneath her fingertips. She glanced at the web that Arachne spun, soft, fragile threads made of silk, but more enduring than mortal cloth. Her gaze softened. "You weave still," Athena said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "Your pride was strong, but your skill was stronger." Her fingers hovered over the edge of the web, careful not to disturb it. Her eyes flicked toward the small spider, her gaze steady, but no longer cold. "So long as you weave with patience, your threads will endure." The villagers exchanged glances, their eyes filled with quiet confusion. "Is she still herself?" one of them asked. "Does she know?" Athena's eyes lifted to the speaker, gray and steady as stone. "Does it matter?" she asked softly. Her voice was neither harsh nor gentle. It was a question without judgment, one that hung in the air like the hum of a distant storm. Her work remains. The owl, Glaucopus, fluttered down from the rooftop and landed softly on Athena's shoulder. It tilted its head, its golden eyes round and unblinking. Athena raised her hand, stroking the back of its head with slow, deliberate care. "Skill without humility is a thread that unravels," Athena said quietly, her gaze distant now. Her eyes flicked to the villagers, her voice carrying the weight of something far older than words. Pride blinds even the most gifted of hands. But patience. She looked toward the spider, still weaving its web, its small legs moving in slow, steady rhythm. Patience builds something that endures. Her words hung in the air, and this time, no one dared to reply. Ormenos nodded slowly, his old hands clasped together. His eyes stayed on the spider. His lips moved in quiet prayer, his words too soft to be heard. The villagers, one by one, bowed their heads. Some whispered prayers of their own. Others stepped away, their eyes wide with awe and reverence. A woman knelt before Athena, placing a small bundle of wildflowers at her feet. Another man, a fisherman with rough hands, took a spool of thread from his satchel and set it by the base of an olive tree nearby. One by one, they left offerings, flowers, thread, bits of cloth, tokens of humility and respect. Athena stepped back, her gaze following each of them as they returned to their homes. Their heads were low, their steps slower than before, as though they were walking beneath the weight of a new understanding. She turned once more to the spider. It had finished its web. The threads were perfect, each line placed with care. A spiral of silver light, strong and fragile all at once. The spider paused at the center of its web, its body still, its legs resting lightly on the threads it had woven. Athena's eyes softened. Patience. She raised her spear slowly. The villagers turned, watching as the goddess lifted the weapon that had struck down armies, toppled tyrants, and carved the fate of kings. But this time, she did not strike. The sharp bronze tip of the spear touched the ground. A soft, hollow thump echoed through the village square. Light flickered at her feet, a soft pulse like the glow of the first star at dusk. The owl on her shoulder blinked once. The villagers watched in quiet awe as the olive tree beside the loom grew brighter. Its leaves shimmered faintly, a soft glow of silver-green light. The offerings left at its base, wildflowers, thread, bits of cloth, were illuminated as if touched by a beam of starlight. Athena's gray eyes lifted to the tree. "From the threads of humility, the strongest cloth is made," she said, her voice like the first sound of rain touching dry soil. "Remember that." The owl hooted softly. Her spear shimmered in her hand. Her cloak shifted behind her, like a slow-moving storm cloud. The villagers watched as her form grew brighter, her edges faintly blurred by soft white light. Her silver armor, her calm gray eyes, the owl on her shoulder, all of it shimmered like strands of silk unraveling into the wind. Her eyes glanced one final time at the spider on its web. "Endure," she whispered, and then she was gone. No flash of light, no crack of thunder, no grand spectacle. She simply left, like the quiet fall of dusk over the land. The villagers stared in silence, the warmth of the olive tree's glow reflecting softly in their eyes. One by one, they stepped away, each carrying with them the quiet weight of the lesson they had witnessed. The spider remained. Its body was still, its 8 legs resting on the web it had built. The world was quiet now. The wind was soft, the clouds drifting slowly past the edge of the sky. No one watched it anymore, but still it wove. Each thread precise, each line strong. No faster than it needed to be, no slower than it should be. No one spoke its name. No one dared. But in the quiet corners of every home, in every dimly lit room, in the shadows of rooftops and the edges of olive trees, whenever someone saw a web glistening with dew in the first light of dawn, they would pause. They would not touch it. They would whisper quietly to themselves, "Arachne still weaves." As you close your eyes, let the echoes of this story guide you to peace. Drift gently into sleep, knowing you are part of a world where love and wisdom shine bright. May your dreams be calm, comforting, and filled with wonder.